If one could transport themselves back in time to experience a rocketing boom period in pop culture entertainment, the year 1984 has to be a leading candidate in the eligibility for re-experiencing a key 12-month cycle. At the box office, Columbia Pictures' Ghostbusters topped the charts, though other popular transcendent films such as Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, as well as the first Karate Kid movie, were released in this same calendar year. Conversely, on the small screen, we would see the debut of what would become classic hits such as the action crime drama known as Miami Vice and the timeless sitcom The Cosby Show. Tuning into your radio stations, Princess When Doves Cry from his Purple Rain album was that year's Billboard Hot 100 leading chart topper, with Tina Turner's What's Love Got to Do With It undergoing comparable success. Though for me personally, I'd go with Van Halen's Jump as my hand-picked favorite song of that year, even if it was released just a few days before 1984 officially began. As for what was happening in the toy industry, Kenner's Star Wars was still experiencing some residual popularity from the previous year's Return of the Jedi movie, and Kenner also did debut the action feature-heavy DC Superpowers toy line, which would last for a few years thereafter. Of particular note though, Hasbro's military-based G.I. Joe: A Real American Hero and Mattel's barbarian-themed Masters of the Universe were simultaneously experiencing peak popularity in both TV and toy form, as well as other forms of complementary media in the young male-targeted demographic. Hasbro would of course double down on this demographic, first by licensing and eventually co-releasing a brand of sentient, transforming robots with Japanese company Takara, which led to the development of a franchise that is still going to this day, namely the Transformers. This is the story of that first year of this historic, iconic cast of robots, and the Autobots and Decepticons we've come to know and love. Let's begin. I have covered some Transformers history before in a previously attempted catch-all video progressing from vintage to modern times in my Evolution of Toys video series, which of course that particular video was meant as more of an overview of this franchise as a whole. Do check out that video if you can spare a few moments. I've also covered the topic of the same cast of 1984 Autobots and Decepticons in modern masterpiece and third-party form across other videos if you're interested in seeing those as well in my channel's back catalog. Hasbro had already adopted a trifecta approach with their production of G.I. Joe action figures, then having the same characters appear both in the Sunbow animated cartoon and on the pages of Marvel Comics. Of course, this formula would see itself play out again with what would become G.I. Joe's simultaneous running mate in toy aisles from coast to coast, the original Generation 1 Transformers. Of course, the nomenclature of Generation 1, or G1, is a bit of a retroactive descriptor, as it was simply called the Transformers until relaunched incarnations with differing sub-branding came out years later. With Hasbro and Marvel already having something of a business relationship, senior Hasbro executive Bob Prupus found himself in the office of Marvel's editor-in-chief, Jim Shooter, about the idea of adapting Takara's DIACLONE and MICROCHANGE toy lines into an American robot toy line. After some backstory writing of his own, Jim Shooter would scour the halls of Marvel's offices in search of a writer capable of further developing the individual Transformers characters. While famed writer Dennis O'Neil did develop some character names, the vast majority of the task fell to the desk of Bob Budiansky. Budiansky would go on to write the bulk of Marvel's Transformers ongoing run, later transitioning the task to another well-known writer in Simon Furman. Of note though, Budiansky would be the man responsible for the individual bios or tech specs as they'd become to be known on the flip side of the original Transformers boxes and card backs. Such character information on the tech specs was vital to the success of the line. The original toys themselves already had existing figures from the aforementioned DIACLONE and MICROCHANGE toy lines, capitalizing on the brilliant long-standing work of designer Yoki-san, as well as utilizing existing figure tooling from Takara in prior years. However, these pre-Transformers were non-sentient robots, many of whom came with pilots in something of a Gundam-type concept scheme. As such, to make these characters relatable beings to a Western demographic, the Transformers were developed as the sentient robots we'd become familiar with later on. As a side note, I personally treat DIACLONE and MICROCHANGE as collectible predecessors to the toys I knew, much in the same way that the original 12-inch G.I. Joe that began in 1964 served as a precursor to the smaller 3 3/4-inch G.I. Joe, A Real American Hero that would launch in 1982. Thus, even if there is a disconnect in the marketing and branding between the Forerunner toy lines and the ones that I grew up with, the developmental backstory was important to cover here, as I find myself fascinated by these earlier figures due to what they represent in toy history and the popular toy lines that they would spawn after the fact. Okay, so regarding where this all leads, our opening cast of 1984 Autobots consisted of 18 characters that could transform into various automobiles. The leader Optimus Prime, and 11 of the cars were adapted from the DIACLONE Car Robots line of 1982, with the remaining 6 smaller, more affordable at the time mini-bots having been developed from MICROCHANGE's Mini Car Robo subset. In similar fashion, the 1984 Decepticons were also drawn from the same 2 toy lines. Megatron was taken from the Uncle version of MICROCHANGE's Gun Robo, Soundwave was a slightly modified MICROCHANGE cassette man, and Soundwave's various cassettes were also brought over from the MICROCHANGE line to serve as Decepticons. Our 3 original Seekers, namely the F-15s of Starscream, Thundercracker, and Skywarp, were taken from the DIACLONE Jet Robo subset. And with that, we had the basis for the Decepticon Nemesis crew and the previously mentioned Autobots who would comprise of the Ark Shuttle crew. And with everything set for a 1984 release, Hasbro ended up being beaten to market by Tonka and their Gobots line of transforming robots. Tonka had licensed the Gobots from Bandai overseas, much in the way that Hasbro had done with Takara to secure the Transformers as an intellectual property. Now, while Gobots did see a 1983 release and did get a high degree of success in 1984, as we all know, Transformers would win the overall battle and outlast Gobots as the years would go by, but this is a video on just the first year of Transformers, so I realize I've digressed here a little, but I thought that this was pretty important to talk about. So let's get back to the topic of hand, the Transformers and the opening year on store shelves. Regarding my own G1 collection, for the most part the figures I have are of originally released Transformers from the 1980s, though a few reissues have made their way into the collection. I'm not saying at all that that's a bad thing, as reissues do allow us to more readily recreate the feeling of opening up a sealed box, pulling the figure out of the insert, and putting on the various stickers to relive that childhood nostalgia of getting a fresh new toy. Of course, there's nothing really to stop us from doing that with vintage figure boxes if the opportunity arises, but I find that those opportunities are just few and far between by comparison to reissues. I'll just note so that I've said it that my Bumblebee figure is a reissue, hence the more cartoon accurate face design, but I do have an original of the red variant of Bumblebee that has the traditional faceplate style look. My Bluestreak figure is also a 2000s era Hasbro reissue with the unchromed missiles and unchromed weapon, which over the years I've grown less fond of, as I don't think anybody would really argue with the fact that chrome versions simply look better. Nevertheless, he's my Bluestreak figure. My Sideswipe is also a 2000s Takara reissue, but with owning a vintage 1993 Generation 2 figure and the vintage Takara DIACLONE Car Robots version in the yellow scheme, it's cool to own a variation of each of these regardless of the release date. In looking at the first year of 18 Autobots, Optimus Prime was clearly designed as the standout character. After all, He's the leader. Now, while I do have the more common released version with the black missiles and unbloated accessories, there are versions out there with the leftover DIACLONE accessories that include a bloated weapon and a fist of more bloated proportions as well, a gray roller, and gray missiles. While Optimus's voice in the Sundo animated cartoon is iconic and immortalized in our minds, the history actually runs a little bit deeper. A 2018 Toys That Made Us episode documents the tale of how voice actor Peter Cullen based Optimus's voice and overall vibe from his brother Larry, a real-life war veteran who Cullen openly admits that his brother's voice came out during the audition for this role, and that voice has stuck ever since. For people like myself, that adds a more profound meaning to a character I had already accepted as a welcome fixture to my past growing up. A hero based on a real-life hero. Another aspect of this cast overall is that what helps them flourish more and adds to the overall dynamic are the unique abilities or character traits that each of them has. What I'm saying here is that each Autobot stands out for specific reasons, some of which I'll go through here, and while they do gel as a team, their individual qualities stand out for various factors. For example, Ironhide is a battle-hardened soldier, a veteran of sorts, who often acts as a bodyguard that doesn't back away from standing up for a teammate. His loyal nature makes him easily likable as an on-screen character, and that's something that, as you'll see with other characters as well, deviates heavily from their originally intended DIACLONE and MICROCHANGE counterparts. Also, while Ratchet has the same figure mold as Ironhide, he's used as more of a repair medic with an ambulance transformation mode and is always ready to apply his doctoral skills when his comrades are injured in battle. I've added some third-party heads to both of my figures to give them some added personality compared to the standard releases and to also give them some level of aesthetic accuracy in line with the cartoon series. Bluestreak, who I talked a little bit about earlier, was a warrior and a gunner of sorts, someone who wasn't afraid to assist teammates in need, such as when he went after Ironhide when the temperamental grunt flew off to chase the Decepticons on his own during the opening 3-part More Than Meets the Eye episodes that kicked off the original cartoon. Of note, Bluestreak appeared in a blue color in the original 1984 catalog, and he also appeared in that color on the G1 box art, but his original figure in 1984 was actually a silvery gray figure, a color correction that would appear in the 1985 figure catalog. Now, he did appear in blue during his DIACLONE days in the Car Robots line, which makes this DIACLONE figure all the more enigmatic and sought after as a holy grail piece of sorts. While I don't own that particular DIACLONE figure, I did pick up a custom, and for some reason I do prefer him more in the color blue, but that's just me. The Autobot scout known as Hound had a soft, friendly personality, and his combat green Jeep color scheme made him relatable as it's a similar color to that of some of the early G.I. Joe vehicles. His gentle nature made him feel like a bit of an underdog at times, but he had a great relationship with the human Spike Witwicky, and could also generate holograms that would come into play to help cause confusion among the Decepticons in battle, thus helping the Autobots win the day on some occasions. A cool, stylish character with a sleek Porsche alternate mode, Jazz was voiced by the famous Scatman Crothers and thus very much had a DJ radio type of voice. He was in some ways a right-hand man, or right-hand bot I should say, to Optimus Prime, sometimes conveying command duties on his behalf. He seemed to be a somewhat cool, all-in-one get-it-done sort of bot. He could fight, he was fast, he had a sense of humor, and just had a charismatic feel overall, such that when I do think about the original Autobots, he's among the standout icons of this year, along with Optimus and Bumblebee. Mirage added another interesting dynamic, being a spy of sorts. His Formula 1 race car mode meant he could keep up with the fastest of them, but his best trait was his special ability to disappear, then reappear elsewhere, hence the name Mirage. This of course played itself out in the opening episodes as well, when he boarded the Decepticon shuttle, busted up the controls, and caused them to crash into the ocean, all while parachuting to victory while his fellow Autobots cheered on. Prowl was known as the combat strategist, a role that played out only sparingly in the cartoon, but his respect as a high-level commander in the Autobots ranks was something that was important throughout the comic runs. His alt mode as a police car gives him some level of authority amongst his fellow heroes. The Lamborghini brothers Sideswipe and Sunstreaker often came as a pair, Sideswipe the more timid of the two, though he did carry a rocket pack that allowed him some level of aerial support to the Autobots when called upon, while Sunstreaker was always highly confident about his paint job, abilities on the battlefield, and the speed he could travel when in car mode. Wheeljack was always the lovable, helpful mechanic, who even had his own workshop of sorts on Cybertron and was always involved in the development of various Autobot gadgetry on Earth. And among Wheeljack's greatest creations were the formidable Dinobots. Though their toys did not appear until 1985, the Dinobots themselves would appear in the cartoon in the initial 1984 year. We also had Trailbreaker, who like Ironhide was known as the muscle on the battlefield. While he admittedly wasn't the fastest Autobot by any stretch, his force field played a vital role in protecting his fellow comrades, and its powers and abilities such as these that would set each Autobot apart, like I said earlier, be it this guy's force field, or the aforementioned holograms by Hound, or Mirage's disappearing act. All in all, the various personalities made each Autobot relatable, and you could find a piece of yourself in one or more of them when watching the show. Regarding the minibots, Bumblebee is often the first to come to mind. Like Hound, he's also an underdog of sorts, and he was also great for tasks such as espionage, and much like Hound as well, he was possibly the most compassionate Autobot, always forming a bond with the various human characters in the animated series. One of my favorites, for sure. We also had Brawn, who was known for his gruff voice and was surprisingly strong and a grunt of sorts, able to take down Decepticons twice his size and do so with ease. Windcharger, on the other hand, didn't have many lines in the cartoon, but his magnetic field of sorts gave him a special ability, much like some of the other Autobots that I talked about earlier. Huffer carried a pessimistic attitude in many episodes, but like Bumblebee he was compassionate as well, such as the time when he offered to pull Prime's trailer for him back to headquarters in the Season 1 episode finale after Prime's showdown and fight with Megatron. And like Huffer, the 4x4 pickup known as Gears was also a bit of a grump, though he did have some cool infrared sensors to help his friends on various missions. Rounding out the core cast of the initial 18 Autobots, we have Cliffjumper, a mini-bot with a big heart and was brave despite his smaller stature. Who could ever forget the opening episodes of the cartoon when he took a blast at Megatron, missed, and resulted in him and Hound having to retreat hastily back to the Ark? Hey, win or lose, I guess it's the thought that counts, even if he did have Megatron dead center in his viewfinder, but failed to end the war on that day. I know I've spent a fair bit of time talking about the Autobots here, and it's largely due to the fact that their cast just has a larger number of figures and characters, especially during that opening year. Though this does make sense, given that some episodes describe the Autobots as being originally consumer goods robots that would battle the military hardware robots that became the Decepticons. Of course, all this was during the ancient days of Cybertron. What I'm saying is, I understand that the Decepticons had a smaller crew as they seemed to be larger bots anyway, who were a bit more formidable in terms of their fighting prowess and war experience, so it's not like they needed the numbers advantage. Now, along that same topic, I figured now would be a good time to summarize the canon storyline as we transition the conversation from the good guys to the bad guys. So as it's told, 4 million years in the distant past, with Cybertron's energy resources depleted due to the perpetual battle between the two sides, the Autobots would blast off in search of new energy sources out in space. Not to be outdone, the Decepticons followed them, with a battle ensuing in space, resulting in the Decepticons boarding the Autobot shuttle and crash landing on planet Earth. Several million years pass, and following the explosion of the volcano for which the Autobot Ark had landed, both sides had awakened, with Teletran 1 adapting Earth modes for our new iconic cast of transforming robots, and thus the battle continued on Earth during the 1980s. As leader of the Decepticons, Megatron was voiced by the talented Frank Welker. Megatron was a ruthless tyrant of a leader who rarely if ever showed mercy, and his gun mode is quite an important aspect of this character, as the toy was able to transform into a legit-looking, more or less regularly scaled Walther P-38 handgun. The aforementioned Toys That Made Us documentary details the story of how a salesperson attempted to board a plane with this in their hand carry and had to transform this figure through security to show that it was actually a toy and not harmful. We don't get stories like that these days. Of note, the gun alternate mode has made this particular figure something of a difficult thing to reissue, and while we have seen some reissues in Japan before of this Megatron gun, in the United States and other parts of the world, the figure ended up utilizing a tank mode as its alternate mode in post G1 releases. Now, I'm not sure if the keep your friends close and your enemies closer concept applies here, but Starscream served as a high-level commander of sorts, being the one to command the seeker jets in the skies for the Decepticons. While he's known for being voiced by Chris Latta, who also famously voiced Cobra Commander, Starscream's most prolific trait is how he often threatened to usurp Megatron for command of the Decepticons. It just always seemed like when they weren't fighting with the Autobots, they were fighting with one another instead. But that is something that keeps the Decepticons rather interesting, and I've always accepted as just part of the warrior nature of the Decepticons as a whole. Thundercracker and Skywarp rounded out the first year's Seeker Jets. You'd often see them together much in the same way that you'd see Sunstreaker and Sideswipe together on the Autobot side, and both were always battle ready just like Starscream. Of note, Skywarp had this awesome ability much like Mirage, where he could disappear and teleport in the skies to get the jump on some unsuspecting Autobots. I've covered Soundwave before in my Evolution of Toys, Soundwave Through the Ages video, but I feel it's important to tread over some familiar territory here. As a communications officer, he's always seemed to be loyal to Megatron first and foremost. While his toy came with the Buzzsaw cassette tape, he was seen more often in the cartoon with Laserbeak by his side. This, of course, wasn't the only semi-mix-up that would occur, as somehow Rumble was purple and blue in the cartoon and Frenzy was a red and black color scheme, which is the way that I tend to think of them in my mind's eye and my memory as a kid. However, in the toys and comics, this was the other way around, so it could be a little bit confusing, but their personalities are so similar that it almost didn't matter. Rounding out the cassettes, Ravage was pretty much as fierce as anyone in terms of being a fighter, but I liked him a lot as he was the only one who didn't have an immediate repainted counterpart like Laserbeak and Buzzsaw having one another, or how Frenzy and Rumble were repaints of one another. So for me, Ravage was the most unique of the first year Decepticon cassettes. So that covers the cast of the Decepticons that were in the original toy line in 1984, though I'll admit that the Nemesis shuttle crew also included Reflector in the cartoon series even if his figures weren't released until later on. I'll also note that while their toys didn't appear until 1985, Shockwave and the Insecticons would appear in Season 1 of the cartoon, and Jetfire on the Autobots side would also appear in the cartoon but had a toy in 1985. So with that, I'll go on and say that the toys of this initial 1984 Transformers year and this era of toys as a whole have always brought a rush of nostalgia to old school fans. But I've also noticed that even those who did grow up after this era can still appreciate the concept of transforming robots and the concept of two warring factions between good and evil. No matter your age, you can still appreciate the dynamic cast and various personalities, such that most fans I've met have multiple favorites among this toy line. And the toys are indeed timeless. In fact, you do see box versions of these hunted for and previewed on such related TV series such as Action Figure Adventure, written and produced by fellow social media personality Rob McCallum and hosted by toy hunting extraordinaire Jay Bartlett. Overall, there's just something magical and indescribable about this magnetic group of Autobots and Decepticons during this initial year of the Transformers franchise. As I watch the series time and again, I find pieces of myself in some of those characters, and if you're watching this, you probably do as well. Perhaps in life you have that noble, heroic personality that you look up to and aspire to be like. Perhaps you've always been regarded as an underdog with an enormous heart and a tremendous will. Maybe you've stood up for others or can name that other person in your life that stood up for you once upon a time. Perhaps you have that friend you keep around but can't seem to explain why. Or perhaps you have that friend you keep around and can totally explain why. Or maybe you can name the smartest person in your life that you respect. Either way, certain attributes in these Autobots and Decepticons really represent something in all of us. And before I conclude this video, tell me the name of the Transformers that you had as a kid, or tell me your favorite Autobot or Decepticon. Please put it down in the comments below. Shout out to my Patreon supporters whose names can be found in the description section of this video. Visit patreon.com/toyconnections to get special perks such as my latest updates and bonus video content. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, press that like button to spread this video to more viewers, and share it with your friends. Otherwise, let's transform and roll out until the next video. See you soon.